Welcome back, everybody, to the School Leadership Show. With me, as always, is co-host Jen David Lang. Hi, Jen.
Hey, Mike, how are you doing?
Fabulous. And we have a very special guest with us today. We have Jeff Zwiers, who is the author of, among other books, Next Steps with Academic Conversations, New Ideas for Improving Learning Through Classroom Talk. Hi, Jeff. How are you?
Good. How are you? It's great to be here.
Fabulous. We're thrilled to have you and to get into this book and your work around communication. And maybe you could start off by telling folks a little bit about yourself, your background, how you came to write this book, and sort of, where your area of focus is in terms of learning and research.
Yeah, I mean, I'm fairly old, so you don't want to go back too far. But I did start off teaching in a high school setting that had a lot of kids who hadn't gone to school a whole lot before showing up, and they had gone to school mostly in Mexico and Guatemala before coming here. And so I got really interested in just language development in general, and not just second language development, but also first language development, and even development of academic uses of language as well. And so that sort of got me on the role of working with students, and then eventually working with teachers around how do we best get language happening in the classroom, particularly oral language, because a lot of things came up, situations came up where you would observe a classroom or you'd shadow a student and you'd see very little talk and even not a lot of extended listening as well. So I started getting interested in just that notion of how can we get more talk, but not just social talk that has nothing to do with classroom. How do we kind of get a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1? That 3-for-1 meaning, how can kids build relationships, kind of get to know each other in the classroom, at least know their names, right? And then how can they also support the building of conceptual ideas, the building of content, and then of course the language. So I started to realize that a lot of language development comes from talking with peers. And yes, a lot comes from home, definitely, we know that. But in the school, we can also leverage that student-student talk as much as we can to help kids, kind of ramp up and their language development in class.
That's great. So let's get into this then. So in terms of getting students to that point or supporting their language development as they interact with other students, with teachers and other staff in the building, you identified some very specific strategies that teachers in particular can use to support those kinds of academic conversations. And then by extension, I would imagine language development. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and even more recently, I've also written a book about communication, which is a broader umbrella that conversations fit within very nicely. And that communication is, we think it might be happening, but I call it pseudo communication. If a student is just going through the motions or saying a sentence frame because the teacher wants them to, or maybe there's points involved, or okay, I don't want to make the teacher mad, so I'm going to raise my hand. That is more of the pseudo. Than the authentic is when I really want to communicate something to either the teacher or the rest of the class or a partner. And so initially, even stepping back from, okay, here's how a conversation works, we also have to set up that purpose. And that purpose is that we are building up. So one of the features of communication is it especially in school, is it builds up an idea in some way, a concept or a claim. So, if I'm a supervisor, administrator, and I'm observing a classroom and I'm observing any activity, there should be any activity that uses language, let's say, there should be the building up, not just the memorization, the short-term memorization, because kids really aren't into that. A lot of kids aren't. There are a few kids that maybe like the memorization for points gig, but a lot of most students kind of want to build up something, a claim or a concept. And so if that's not happening, whether it's between two students or even if they're reading or writing or whatever, then that can be less engaging and even, just less interesting. And then the second feature would be, is there clarification and support, which are actually two of the main skills that you'll see in the next steps in with Academic Conversations book. Those are the two biggies in terms of skills during the conversation that you want to listen for. A lot of kids, and this was even pre-pandemic, but even post-pandemic, a lot of kids haven't had a lot of face-to-face, like live interactions where they're building up ideas together. And even before that, though, a lot of kids haven't realized that, whoa, I can just keep on asking for clarification and I need to clarify, or I can keep on asking for support for a claim or a concept, like details, some kind of support. And this is how we have a conversation. In fact, most of our conversations are like that. In fact, I might say something that's a little confusing or slightly interesting, and Jen might say, well, wait, can you go back? Can you clarify that part about this? Or can you give an example in the classroom, in a science classroom? So that's kind of what a conversation between kids we would be looking for if I'm a teacher or, let's say an observer in the classroom. And it should also be on these little tools we use when we're observing classrooms as well, right? I know there's a lot of those checklisty type things, whether it's electronic or not. And I'm always kind of pushing for this. Look for these things. Well, the third feature that I have, just while I have you, the third feature is there should be an information gap. So each person in whatever, if let's say it's a conversation, since we're talking about conversations, each person shouldn't have the same exact information to share. If they do, there's not much reason to listen or speak. But if we have something different, like a jigsaw activity, you've probably seen jigsaws where each kid reads a different text and then shares it. That's great because they're an expert in that piece of text, let's say. But if you don't have the first two features, if there's no bigger idea you're building up, or there's not clarifying and support, that jigsaw can be a lot weaker. In fact, I've often seen kids just think the purpose of a jigsaw is, well, pass the paper around and we'll copy and fill in our charts. And that's it.
That's not the purpose of a jigsaw? Oh, I
Exactly.
thought it was. Well, it's interesting to hear you say that, because when I think back to all those hundreds of teacher observations I did in 10 years as a principal, it's like it was just those teachers that were really, really good at that. Like, I don't know that I had the language as a supervisor to unpack that or to name that I just knew it was good. And I knew kids were engaged. So how do you coach teachers through that? And I don't know if that's a question for later, or maybe it's more about students now, but take it wherever you want to go, because I know that was a gap for me as a principal, because it was one of those things like, well, I know it when I see it, but boy, wouldn't that be great if all the teachers that I supervised did it?
Mm-hmm.
Before he jumps in about the coaching, Mike, did you see, because with the Accountable Talk movement, teachers knew they had to get students to talk like this. And it's so interesting, Jeff, talking about this, what did you call it? Pseudo communication. Did you hear a lot of, because I've been in a lot of classrooms myself, a lot of that kind of check the box, where a student says something, another student says, so building on what Mike says, because they know that's what they're supposed to say, but then they're not building on, and it's really did you hear a lot of that in classrooms? Because I definitely have. So I'm wondering about going from either no true academic kind of conversations, or even this sort of pseudo one, and how you coach teachers to make it even more complicated.
Yeah. No, and it's been very difficult. And I always tell people this is really messy work. Every conversation is different. So like, what do you do? Every conversation is totally different. But looking for these key features and setting that foundational purpose. So, if you just say, okay, this is what a conversation sounds like to kids, they might mimic it, memorize some of the sentence frames and do that. Like, I'd like to piggyback off of what she says. Those kinds of things, right? But then there's still, I would say, even that's semi-pseudo. Maybe they are kind of having a somewhat of a conversation. There's the structure there, but the purpose, the direction might not be there. So we need to tell kids and and everyone in the school, this is what we do. We build up ideas. When you're reading, when you're writing, and especially in a conversation, you're going to walk into that conversation and your expectation should be an idea that's a little more clear or a little stronger than it was before, right? Or maybe it's a new idea. Maybe your partner poses an idea that's an answer to the question, and that just comes up. But when that idea comes out, that initial, I call that kind of idea starter, comes out of your partner or comes out of you, both of you, this is when you start, this is what we're doing. We're building up this idea. Now, it's nice to hear things like piggyback on, or I agree with you, because, and I will include those at times, but the real core is not hearing those things if they're not authentic, right? The core is that kids with that whatever language, I don't care, L1, L2, acting out, using diagrams, visuals, art, I don't care, that they're building up an idea and helping each other do that. That's that's really the core that we should be looking for, whether or not they use, really nice accountable talk moves or academic expressions, whatever, right? Even the move, huh? That's not very academic. And I have a nice video of a first grader saying huh to another kid. And that huh move is actually really valuable because it's telling the other kid, you know what, I didn't quite get what I need you to clarify something you said, and it's worth it to me to listen again. And I hope it's okay if you, repeat it again. So we're building up something just based on that, little 3-letter clarify move that doesn't sound academic. So that's where I think, and then later on, if we want to kind of add some more academic, response moves, that's fine, but we can't put that cart before the horse.
There's 2 ingredients that you have that I think are very helpful in creating classrooms where there are these kinds of academic conversations. One, you talk about the importance of focusing on mindset, and that's something we're talking about a lot in education right now. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about, what is the mindset needed so that we can move students from, I want to give the shortest, quickest answer and get this teacher off my back attitude. That's the first ingredient.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second ingredient, having buildable ideas that are worth discussing, right? It's not
Mm-hmm.
that interesting to discuss 7 + 12, right? But to say, I wonder what are all the ways you could arrange 12 up, right? Or, it's not that interesting to give just a basic, this is the part of the cell that's the nucleus, but, the argument, we shouldn't have zoos. So trying to create the kinds of conversational topics that kids actually can engage in. So can you talk about the mindset as well as the buildable idea piece?
Yeah, definitely. The mindset piece, of course, everyone's familiar with growth mindset, and that can and does play a role as well, because one of the exciting things about conversations, even though they're messy and they don't always turn out, you as a supervisor could go into a classroom and the 2 kids that are back by you are talking about the party Friday night, right? I know, but the exciting thing is the more that we get kids used to, like, this is what we do when we enter a conversation. We share the stuff that we have, we build up an idea. So the mindset is more of this is how we learn. We build up ideas together. Or even if on my own, I'm building up an idea and I'm reading, but I'm going to share that with someone else. I'm going to see what they think about how, my impression of, I'm going to try to get some more building blocks from my partners. That's a mindset, I think. So the mindset is not, I'm going to memorize this stuff and do well on the test. And so that's the real difficult part, is there's still going to be, like, I would say, units, moments, times during the year where the default is the point thing, right? But the mindset really should be that, okay, well, as much as possible, we're going to try to get you excited about building some of these concepts and ideas. I mean, you mentioned math, right? A lot of kids, some kids like math, some kids do not, and they don't want to play the game of answering problems for points. If you can pull a few kids over who are like, okay, you're going to build up this mathematical idea of how math works, and you're going to communicate it to some other people, ideally people who don't know that particular concept. then it's a little more interesting. I'm not saying it's a guarantee that all kids will be totally stoked about it, but it's a little, you might bring a few more kids over into the engaging more often, in the time. That's kind of what we're looking at. And some kids just do not buy into the grade thing. It's like, I'm doing the bare minimum for whatever someone tells me I have to get. And that is really not much for a lot of kids, right? And so we really are trying to bump as many kids as we can into the use a second and third sentence in a pair share rather than one sentence or half a sentence. I usually kind of reduce it down to that pair share example, because if a kid, really wants to get their idea across, they'll use a second and third sentence. And the other kid who really wants to know it might ask for, clarification or support. So it's that kind of mindset. And then regarding the buildable ideas, I think that's a bigger challenge, because we have a lot of set curriculums that are just sitting in folders and binders and in books, that they might have an essential question, which can have potential, right? Some units I've seen start off with essential question. Some of them never do anything about the essential question until the very end. They say, here, write about this. So I would say the work would be, how do we, and I'm doing this work with a curriculum in my local district. I'm going there tomorrow, meeting with teachers, and we're saying, okay, how can we make these units more engaging in terms of having buildable ideas? So we'll look at the essential question, and I'll say, okay, what's the first sentence that you would want a kid to answer that essential question with? And that's the idea starter, or kind of a thesis statement, topic sentence. And then we'd say, okay, now what do we need to do to help kids, both, in all the reading, writing, listening, speaking, but especially in conversations, what do we need to do so that at the end of this unit, let's say, they can have a conversation and have a lot of things to say about this idea. It's been built up.
Well, and I love that it starts with curriculum, because it's hard to have a meaningful academic conversation about garbage, right? Mm-hmm. And if the curriculum is guaranteed, viable, and robust, I mean, that's a place to start, mm-hmm. Certainly. Yeah. So beyond, so let's say that's in place. Let's say you go to this district tomorrow and you whip them into shape and they're ready to go. The curriculum's where it needs to be. They've got the essential questions ready to go. Then what's the teacher supposed to do? Beyond modeling, how do you get kids to engage in productive academic conversations?
Well, I mean, a couple of things. One is that you do have them practice these conversations with, and the great thing about a classroom is that you have a lot of different conversation partners. So I do recommend not just having the same, next to you partner the whole time, because they might already know what you're going to share. So having kind of these conversation sharing structures, one of which I use it's not exactly a conversation, but it's called Stronger and Clear Each Time. And, it's a conversation line where each time a kid shares, like they'll switch partners. And then the third time they're using ideas from their previous partner. And so it's a lineup thing. They get to stand up, they're sharing their ideas. But I, each time before they switch partner, I say the next time I want it stronger and clear, because if you don't say that, it's just going to be the same usually. Just like we would probably, it's easier to say the same thing. But if we say, okay, or take 20 seconds, take some notes from what your last partner said, this better be stronger and clear than it was before, right? That's just one kind of practice structure for conversations. It's not necessarily meant to be a full-on back and forth, but it's a nice oral practice structure for them. So there's conversation preparation, which I just mentioned. There's another one called pro-con that is even easier, because one person is saying, okay, the topic is, let's say, plastic bags. You mentioned garbage, right? Plastic bags are not in our stores, right? Well, so that then you could just say plastic bags pro, plastic bags con, and the talker goes back and forth and talks about the pros and cons. But I always emphasize, when you answer one of the pros of that topic, I want more than one sentence. So it becomes a little bit like answering in paragraphs. So it starts to train kids, because a lot of kids are used to, and adults too, right? Jumping around and not speaking in paragraphs, but speaking in, like, either one word, half sentence, or one sentence, and then it jumps around. So we're trying to train them to extend their thoughts, because in conversations, that's what you want too. You don't want always just one sentence here, one sentence, one sentence, one sentence, one sentence. It's not a great use of time. And you don't want each listener always asking for, oh, well, can you tell me more about that? Tell me more, clarify. You want kids to kind of have that practice and walk in. There's still going to be those times, but you want them to walk in with a little more, a little more conversational prowess, which means usually it's, two or more sentences per turn. There probably could be more. One thing before I forget, and I don't know if this is going to come up, another is just having these graphic organizers for conversations. So one, I have more or less two types of conversations. One is building up one idea. So if we're talking about, excuse me, if we're talking about photosynthesis, there isn't a whole lot of argument there, right? But there is a lot of things we can talk about. There's a lot of support. There's examples of it. There's a lot of like what happens in the process. But if we're talking about cell phones in school, or any other kind of controversial topic like plastic bags in stores, then, and this is really important, because there's this graphic organizer I call the argument balance scale, and where you build up both sides before you decide. And that's what a lot of people don't do. We're talking out in the world, we see horrible argumentation and egregious persuasion all the time without seeking the truth. It's usually highly biased, as we know, right? We see that all the time. And so it's really getting kids to look at, okay, well, I don't initially believe in this other side, but I'm going to build it up anyway. And so it's that mindset, we're back to it's the mindset that, seek the truth and not to win, especially, not thinking that you know it all already, right?
I think my two big takeaways right now are horrible argumentation and egregious persuasion. Love it. So, well, I was going to, it's awesome. I love that you mentioned the graphic organizers, because that was going to be a question of mine. What role does writing have in supporting these sorts of academic conversations?
Well, it's huge. I mean, even in that activity, Stronger and Clearer Each Time, I didn't mention the pre and post writing, but you could also have a pre and post writing for any of these oral language activities and conversations. There's one activity that I've done with multiple districts called Write, Converse, Write. Same thing. You write about the prompt, then you converse about it with one or more people. Doesn't really matter how many. And then you write about it again. And it's pretty much all the time the writing gets better. It might get a little more confusing because they're trying to add more stuff, but I'd rather have that, like having more stuff to write about, usually from the conversation. And a lot of times you'll have in the conversation, someone asks you for clarification, and you end up clarifying the unclear pre-writing in your post-writing, because you realize, this wasn't very clear, so I'm going to clarify it in my post-writing. So, and the nice thing about the pre-writing also is it sets you up for a decent conversation, or it gets your brain moving, and okay, here's some examples, here's some terms. So it's a little bit of a warm-up for the conversation. So it's kind of a double, it helps you double. It helps the pre-writing helps the conversation helps the post-writing.
Well, and I think it's just such it's a nuance, I guess, or a shift in thinking when I think about, doing those teacher observations, because as an observer, at least back, in the old days when I learned, it was, what does the teacher say? And then what does the student say? And then it was always this back and forth, teacher, student, teacher, student, teacher, student, and not really much focus on how the students talk with one another. So I feel like that's a shift that observers need to pay attention to and make, but I think also teachers in terms of, yes, it's important that you ask good questions, but it's also important that you coach good conversations.
Right, right. Yeah, and even those good questions, I mean, I'm always looking at, so let's say you're at a whole class discussion that you just mentioned, which was very teacher centered, right? Kids answer a few questions here and there, hoping their answer's right. Maybe you push one kid to, to clarify but overall, are the kid in the mind of the kids, are they thinking this conversation in the classroom, this is helping me and helping my partners build up this particular idea about something? And that's, I think that again, the mindset is like every time, that's what I would hope. But a lot of times it's like, okay, did I get the answer right? And then, oh, I just answered the answer right. She's not going to call me for a while. Right. Or it's another kid, the 4 or 5 kids that are always answering the questions, trying to, and the other kids are like, again. And so I'm not saying that's how it is all the time, but there are quite a few of those types of, teacher-centered, trying to answer the questions. Kids aren't really sure where they're going. Even the debate situation is like, some kids are just, I'm going to try to argue my point. And without realizing there are 25 other kids, not necessarily with other opinions, but they might have some decent evidence and examples and arguments for each side that I could build up in my head to make an even better decision. I still might, and I tell kids, if you're going to have a conversation that's an argument, park your initial opinion way back in your head. Park it back there. You don't need to spout it off right away in the conversation. In fact, I often tell people what's music to my ears in the beginning of an argument conversation is if a kid says, which side should we build up first? When you think about that, that is like, it's not a big deal, but it is a big deal because we, and I don't know where it came from, but have been trained to like already make a decision. Okay, well, like, what's your opinion on this? Well, ideally the kid would say, it's not really formed yet. I'm leaning on a certain side right now, but I'm willing to change. Right. And that's a mindset that would be great to have in when these kids become adults. Right.
Well, right.
Given our country, the divisiveness now, if that's the one thing the kids get out of your class is the ability to look into evidence and arguments on both sides before forming an opinion, then I can say that you've done your work as a school, and
to understand the value of the values. I mean, one of the things that comes up is when you do this weighing at the end, you're evaluating the weight of evidence on each side, and then what you're doing is you need to explain why you value certain things. Because if you have a kid that values something a little more than another, they might disagree at the end. But they realize it's okay to disagree because we have different values, right? A lot of that comes up with what we value and then explaining those values and respecting those ideally.
I want to be aware of time, but I want to pull it back to the macro level a little bit, just because most listeners are district and school leaders. So part of why I chose to feature this book in the main idea is because, you really can teach these skills practically K-12, any subject. You could do it in art, you could do it in science. It's not just ELA or history. So it's a great book to bring to your school, and it's a great skill to teach cross school, to have school-wide practices. So if someone's a listener and they're a principal who wants to bring these ideas to their school, like, what do you think their teams of teachers should do first? Should they teach the skills? Should they come up with buildable ideas? Like, what's a first step in bringing this to scale at your school if you want to see academic conversations happening every subject, every grade?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I know a lot of schools are in different places, but I think the first step would be to look at the curriculum and see, well, where is each unit going? Is there an idea to be built up, or several really meaty ideas that kids can build up with different partners in conversations? Because I really emphasize, even though you can model skills in the whole class and have some good discussions, it's still very hard to get everyone involved. in that discussion, at least in a rich level. So I'm usually promoting, pairs or triads in that. And so they know that when they're talking in a triad or a pair, they're going to have to share and they're going to have to listen, and they're building up that idea so they can answer that essential question or do whatever performance task at the end. So the other thing I would do is also think about, the end goal should not just be doing well in a test. It should be something more interesting that communicates your idea to others, or, others that don't know it, or something that's not just, okay, let's do all this stuff and then just answer A, B, C, or D, right? So that would be that, or just write an essay. Now the essay, could be helped by a lot of conversations, but even just the word essay does not excite anybody that I've ever met. Reading or writing, right?
I would agree completely.
So for administrators, coaches, it's really, I think it's important to set that up, that this is how we learn around here. We're not just checking off standards. We're not just, trying to get to the week or 2 week long test in May. We are trying to build up, these really important ideas across these disciplines. Conversation is one way to do it. And it's a powerful way to do it because it not only builds content, it builds language, and it builds relationships along the way.
So it never ceases to amaze me, Jen, how fast these conversations go. I feel like we could talk for hours about this, and it's amazing. So Jeff Sweers, the book is Next Steps with Academic Conversations, New Ideas for Improving Learning Through Classroom Talk. And you do have some more recent work. Do you want to mention?
Well, I have another book that came out at the same time called The Communication Effect, and I forgot the rest of the title. But it's a little more of the umbrella of communication. So it includes chapters on reading, writing, listening, speaking, and conversing. The Next Steps with Academic Conversations is all on, the conversations for the most part. But yeah.
Would you recommend, if you were going to recommend an order in which to read those books for school leaders, do you have a recommendation?
I would maybe start with, I would, if you really have a need for the conversation, it depends on what you want, right? But I would start with the Communication Effect book just as an overview. It also includes a lot of like the jigsaw activity I mentioned. I call it enhancing it with authentic communication. So it includes, or pair shares, I think come in 2 different chapters, but listening and speaking. It includes ways to enhance those activities for more authentic communication. And then the conversation chapter would be, if you really wanted a really expanded version of the conversation chapter, you would get the Next Steps with Academic Conversations.
Makes sense. Jen,
Yeah.
Any parting shots?
No, I think this work is particularly important right now. I think schools, teachers, students, everyone's ready to dive back into the academics. And I think that starting with something like conversations is a great piece, just because of what you said, that it's not just building content and skills, but it's also building relationships, which we know schools are focusing on SEL now too. So it seems like a perfect cross section. Thank you for the book.
Yeah.
Jeff, I'll link to both books in the show notes, but if people want to learn more about you and your work, is there any particular place we should send them?
I mean, not necessarily. I don't know. I have a website that works most of the time, and that's jeffsweers.org.
Sounds
it just
good.
Mostly people use it, I think, to get an email for me. But it also has some downloadable tools. I'm not sure. I haven't quite updated it perfectly, but it does have a tools page. Everything's free and downloadable. And then if anyone has any questions, I'm pretty good on email as well about those tools.
Fabulous. We will send them your way. Jeff, thank you so much.
Okay.
Jen, thank you as always. Appreciate the fantastic conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the School Leadership Show, a podcast for aspiring and practicing school leaders. Send your comments, questions, and show ideas to me, Mike, at schoolleadershipshow.com. And please consider rating the podcast in iTunes and leaving a comment. And definitely pass the show along to your colleagues.